welcome to Monday's lesson, November 14th, 2016. So today I'm going to try to go quickly. I have a ton of information to give you. So as you can see here for your do now, I wanted you to pick up a worksheet which you can find on Google Classroom under the About section. You can go down to OOTD, which stands for Out of the Dust, Background Information. And so I would like you to make either a digital or an actual printed copy of this timeline. We're going to be using this timeline throughout the work that we do with our new book, Out of the Dust. So it's going to be important that you do have the notes for this timeline. And then also we're going to take a look at some pictures today too, so that you can start to get a visual feel, not just a historical event timeline feel for the time period that Out of the Dust took place in. So we're going to pretend we're a history class just a little bit this week because the historical context of this book is so incredibly important for you to truly understand the characters and the events that take place in this book. These major events are so pivotal in American history and they impacted every single American that there's no way that we can't talk about them if we actually want to have a real discussion about the book. So I hope that you are ready for a bit of a lecture from me when it comes to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. So those are the two major events we're going to be talking about today. So make sure that you have your timeline. I'd prefer it printed if you're able to, but if not, just go here and make a digital copy for yourself so that you can make some edits on here. All right, so your story is due today, by the way, which means tomorrow you can have a couple minutes to print your narrative, turn in your reflection sheet, and staple it all together. Okay, so the reason why we are looking at historical fiction for our book Out of the Dust is because the genre is, I don't know if I just said we're looking at historical fiction. I don't know. Sorry, it's late. So the genre of the book Out of the Dust is historical fiction, which is why we have to look at historical events. All right. We're also going to look at multiple perspectives on these major historical events this week. And the reason why we look at different perspectives about the same event is because it helps us strengthen our critical thinking skills. It strengthens our arguments if we ever want to make them, and it helps us understand each other. So for example, we could all go through one major event, it's the same event, but each of us, because we're different, we have these different life experiences, is going to have a different experience with that event. So we're going to look at that event differently. For example, if I have a ton of money and you don't have as much money, you might say that event impacted you more, where my money kept me safe, for example. So just different things about people make them experience these events in different ways, even though it is the same event. Okay, so the event that we're going to be starting off with is the Great Depression. And on your timeline notes, I would like you to put the dates 1929 through 1939. So that's 10 years of the Great Depression. I'm sure you have some background knowledge of the Great Depression, which is awesome. So here's what I'd like you to do. I want you to highlight a section in your timeline if you are doing a digital copy. If not, just draw a little line right before 9:30 and go ahead and make a comment. Oh shoot, I don't know if this is mine or if I share this document with teachers. Okay, and so you're going to write 1929 is start of Great, and that should be capitalized, Great Depression. All right, great. So I would click comment, but I don't think this is my document. I think I share this with people, so I'm just going to click out of it. And that goes to 1939. So I'm just going to highlight 1940. If I have a digital copy, make a comment and say something like maybe 1939, Great Depression ends. Okay? But if I have an actual hard copy, I would just draw a little line right before 1940 and I would write in that information. Okay, so 10-year period of economic crisis where a large portion of the U.S. lost their jobs, which led to homelessness, poverty, and overall chaos. So the Great Depression, you could argue, did not bring out the best in people. We saw a lot of strength from people, and sometimes it really strengthened some familial bonds. However, it also tore families apart, and it kind of made every man and woman look out for him or herself, and so people were not exactly treating each other with the most respect and kindness. Okay, at the same time as the Great Depression, we have the Dust Bowl happening, 1930 to 1940. So I need you to go to your timeline notes again, and you're going to make another comment, or you're going to draw a line, 1930 to 1940. We've got the Dust Bowl, a 10-year period of drought. So under this section for the Dust Bowl, we're going to get into more detail about what the Dust Bowl was. But I'll just give you a little overview right now. So you can write on your timeline where you've got the 10-year period of the Dust Bowl. You can give yourself some bullet points, and you can write that this is a period that was caused by bad farming techniques and drought, and it brought about intense dust storms in the south central U.S. And if you need to pause this slide, go ahead, because I'm going to move on. All right, so this is where the Dust Bowl had its primary impact, this little orange stain here. Okay. So our main character, Billy Joe, is growing up in the Oklahoma Panhandle right here, which is where the severity of the Dust Bowl was. This is the worst of it. So she's growing up in the Dust Bowl, and she's growing up in the Great Depression. So things are not great for Billy Joe, which is why we're talking about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, because she has to live through both at the same time. Oh my gosh. So I'm going to give you a quick visual of the Dust Bowl, and then we're going to get back to our notes. So this is a real picture of a dust storm that happened during the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Not photoshopped or anything. And I just cannot imagine what it must have felt like to be these people or a child and just see this wall of dust come at you like a wave, a tsunami of dust. And we'll talk about how things got so dusty and what people did in response to that dust. All right, but let's back it up a little bit. And in order to understand how things got so dusty and how things got so depressing, the Great Depression, we really have to start at World War I. Okay, so like I said, this is a lecture. We're going to pretend that we're a history class just for a little bit. So World War I on your timeline, you need to have from 1914 to 1918. All right, so pause this and write down what makes sense for you in terms of these bullet points, and then I'm going to go through them verbally because sometimes it helps just to hear someone explain the connection between some major events, okay? So for your bullet points, I want you to write down what for you helps you characterize World War I. Okay, you don't have to write down these complete sentences, just give yourself quick reminders of the key points in World War I, and you're doing this on your timeline. Okay, 1914 to 1918. This is where you should have those bullet points for World War I. All right, so World War I. This is where a lot of things start. Farming demand increases to feed the soldiers overseas. So what do U.S. farmers do? They buy more land. People move out to the Great Plains, okay, this area here, that little brown spot, and they start having really successful farms. They start hiring more workers to, help them farm the land, and they're making some good money, turning some good profit. And they're feeding soldiers, not just American soldiers in 1917 when we enter the war, but they're also feeding soldiers from different countries in Europe. Okay, so in 1917, America enters the war, and for example, if you're a farmer and you've bought a ton of land and then you have a lot of young men leaving the country to go overseas, you're going to be short some farm help. So what do? We hire some Mexican laborers at a cheap price, and we have them work under poor working conditions. And typically the U.S. has a quota for how many immigrants we're going to let in and whatnot. But the U.S. government decides to look the other way, and they allow more Mexican immigrants in than they normally would because of this time where we needed more labor. So unfortunately, Mexican laborers are taken advantage of, and they're not treated very fairly. Okay, so all of this in some way should be on your timeline because it all plays into what we're going to be talking about. So after the war, we go into this economic peak. It's called the Roaring Twenties, so 1920 to 1929. Man, this sounds like a good time. If I could just teleport, well, I guess not teleport, right? Go back in time travel to the 1920s for a little bit, I would do it. So 1920 to right before 1930, 1929, as you know, this is when the Great Depression starts, so when that fun stops. we've got a big economic boom because of World War I. So go ahead and pause again. I want you to take down the key points from this slide on your timeline. All right, so if you are a history buff, if you like wars and things like that, please feel free to let me know in an email or talk to me in class tomorrow if I misspoke about anything in this historical timeline. I do my best in terms of research, but there are so many details that it's really hard to keep track of all of the moving pieces that impact each other during this time. So during the Roaring 20s, people get a little too confident in terms of their spending ability. Banks loan out money, credit becomes popular, and people are purchasing things like no other. We really start to have this culture of consumerism. And, you know, that's fine, except for it actually turns out to be bad. So women, though, they kind of take on this liberal culture, and they start smoking and drinking in public. They wear shorter skirts, shorter dresses. They start acting more like, quote, men. And it starts becoming acceptable for women to maybe start finding work outside the home. Okay, jazz music also starts to become popular and is synonymous with a more liberal, fast-paced lifestyle. So this is the Roaring 20s, aka the Jazz Age. All right, so like I said, yeah, it's good to have fun. You know, if you can take out a loan and pay it back, that's great. However, in 1929, the stock market crashes, and this is what catapults us into the Great Depression. So banks are forced to call in their loans, and people don't have the money to pay back what they've borrowed. So these banks that aren't getting the money back that they need are not able to keep in business themselves. So if there is not enough money to go around, if nobody's getting paid what they owe, companies start to go out of business. And once companies go out of business, people start getting laid off and fired. And once people are laid off and fired, they can't spend money, which means more companies go out of business, which means more people get laid off and fired. And it's just a vicious circle. So, people start to sell their homes, they sell cars, they sell all of their financial assets that they have. And it leaves a lot of people homeless, destitute, living in shacks, literally. Families fall apart, okay? But this is just the start of it, 1929. We're really not at that point yet where people are incredibly desperate. They don't really realize at this point that it's going to be 10 years of just, you know, economic collapse. All right, so I got a little bit ahead of myself. Here's a slide for the Great Depression and really the impact that it had. So again, I want you to take these bullet points. I want you to write down what makes sense for you on your timeline under the 1929 to 1939 section for the Great Depression. And go ahead and pause, write down what you need. Okay, so I want to talk about the last 2 bullet points here, because this is going to help us with our work on perspective. So the reason why I mention race when it comes to unemployment is because clearly there were different unemployment rates for the different races. So 25% is high. That is scary to think of 1 in 4 people not having work when they're actively looking for work. Okay, but that was for white men. And that is a struggle. It's not okay, right? But that's the number that typically gets talked about and thrown around. When 50% of African American men, okay, 1 and 2, they didn't have work, they were unemployed. So both of those are crappy, both of those suck, but just depending on who you were, it sucked at a different level. Okay, and at the same time, if we look at it from a different perspective, Mexicans and Mexican Americans were getting deported in massive numbers. And the reason why is because if you'll remember back in World War I, we recruited them over to help us out when we had a labor shortage. But now Americans don't have jobs. So we don't want the Mexicans, for example, to be taking the jobs that Americans would normally have. So we round up Mexicans and Mexican Americans, okay? Even if you were a US citizen, if you were Mexican, you were likely to be deported or you were in danger of being deported. And sometimes we didn't let them actually collect the paychecks that they were owed, cash out their savings accounts, maybe sell their cars, take their belongings, find their family members. Sometimes they were just sent back in waves and they didn't have time to kind of get their lives in order. And Mexico wasn't doing too great at this time either, and so we sent over a lot of people, poor people, and Mexico's infrastructure wasn't ready to handle them. So it created the problem for the Mexican government as well. Again, it's about perspective. So this just sucks all the way around, sucks in different ways depending on who you are. Okay, so at the same time as the wonderful Great Depression, we have the Dust Bowl. And again, 1930 to 1940. So this again kind of goes back to World War I. During World War I, there was a huge demand for crops, for wheat in particular. And so farmers went out and they bought up land, like I said, and they kept growing the same type of crop in the same area of land over and over and over again. And now we know that that's not a good idea, because if you do that, that same crop uses the same nutrients over and over and over again, and the soil eventually ends up becoming nutrient depleted. And it just ends up being this really fine, dust, sandy material that can't hold any life. It isn't grounded. So any type of wind, any breeze could easily just pick it up. Okay, there's nothing, there's no moisture, there's no density holding it to the ground. There's not anything living on top of it because nothing will grow on it anymore. It's so dry that when the winds come, there's nothing to protect the soil from, picking up. So World War I, bad farming techniques, and a period of drought, so virtually no rain, no moisture, is causing just no growth of anything. And these farmers had made a livelihood. They've bought up all of this land to feed all those soldiers overseas. However, there's no demand anymore, and there's no even crops. They can't grow anything. So things are not looking too good for our farmers in that Central Plains, South Central area of the U.S. And this is exactly where our main character is, Billy Joe. Her dad's a farmer. Sorry, Billy Joe. Let's see, anything else that I want to talk about for the Dust Bowl right now? Okay, so there are these things. They're major dust storms. And they happened weekly, daily, 10 years of this. Just insane. But before we get to these pictures and we talk about it, and I'll let you watch some YouTube videos on your own time, I do want to just quickly talk about World War II, and we'll leave it at that because after this point, it's really not relevant for our book at all. So Billy Joe's life in our book doesn't really go through World War II, but I want to help you get some more historical context for the different perspectives of the Great Depression that we've been talking about. So World War II helps us get out of this Great Depression because war is a moneymaker. So we're pulled out of the Depression, thanks World War II. And again, we have young men going out to fight in the wars, and they're no longer available for different laboring jobs. So what do? We hire back the Mexicans. We're like, hey, we need you now. But the Mexican government is like, you didn't treat us too well last time, and you kind of threw us a curveball when you sent everybody back here, and that wasn't too great for us. So then the U.S. and Mexico decides to draw up this Bracero program, where apparently there would be contracts for better paying jobs, better working conditions, but a lot of times, I won't say all the time, but a lot of times it didn't happen because there were people who were willing to work for lower wages and poorer conditions, and there were farmers who were willing to take advantage of that. So if you know that you're guaranteed a job because you'll work for a little bit less money and a little bit poorer working condition, then maybe you're going to do that for you and your family. So that's that. That's, again, it's just to help us get a better perspective of what Mexicans and Americans went through during the early to mid 1900s. And this is all happening at the same time as our main character, Billy Joe, is growing up and really starting to get to know who she is as a person. So what I would like you to do on your own time is somehow, how can I do this? I'll post this for you. I want you to watch these two videos on the Dust Bowl because I think it gives a great visual to what was happening at the time. So I'll put this on Classroom. Okay. Whew, so this is the first picture that we're going to be looking at. We're just going to look at two pictures together today, and this information can be taken down here for photo 1. So I simply want you to tell me what you see happening. What story does this image tell? And I want you to pause and I want you to think about that and write. Once you've got C done, I want you to do a close read, which means you are going to assess the tone and mood of this picture. So if you were the photographer, what do you think your emotions would be towards this giant dust cloud overtaking this small town? Do you think that you would feel in awe, shocked, petrified, scared? What are some of the emotions you think that photographer felt as he or she stood and captured this moment? Okay, and then mood is, how do you feel? When you look at this picture, how do you feel? Are you in disbelief? Are you scared? Okay, so this next one, questions. What do you want to know? When you look at this picture, what questions instantly pop in your mind? So for example, a lot of students today said, how did anybody survive? Would you die instantly if you were caught in that giant dust storm? Okay, what are these people still doing outside of their homes? Are they running or are they just standing there like, hey, look, another one? Why didn't the photographer run away? What happens to houses after they get caught in a dust storm? And the last one is create a caption for the picture. So this caption needs to be relevant, which means I want you to create a title, a one-line sentence that describes this picture. And now this could be kind of goofy and creative, or it could just be matter of fact. So I had some students say things like death by dust, which was a bit more creative. And then some other students were just more factual, like giant dust storm overtakes small town. And that was their caption. So it's really up to you. And after we assess this one, after you're done, this is our second picture here. Okay, and I want you to notice the baby in her arms. A lot of you have probably seen this picture before because it's pretty famous in terms of this era's pictures. So you're going to go through the same deal where you go through C, close read, questions, and caption for this picture. So go ahead and pause me and work through this on your own. All right, so I've taken you up to where we left off as a class today. I'm excited to go through the rest of these pictures with you tomorrow, and we're going to do some research on the 1930s where you're actually going to be able to kind of dig into this topic and not just listen to me talk about it. So I'm going to post this for you. These videos are pretty cool. Yeah, thanks for listening, and you need your timeline notes with you tomorrow and throughout the rest of our book study of Out of the Dust.